Hello, and thank you for the invitation to talk about data literacy, data governance, and other data-related items with you today. I'm very, very sorry that I can't be there live, but the US judicial system has decided it requires my wisdom more than you do, and so I am currently finding out whether or not I will be serving on a jury. In the meantime, I will do my best to try and tell you my stories and share the thoughts that I have about these topics, and hopefully you can learn something from my experiences. So I'm not sure what the introduction you got about me was before this session, since I had to record this in advance, but let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is San Cannon. I am the Associate Vice Provost for Data Governance and Chief Data Officer at the University of Rochester. So I'm the first person to be in this position. I'm kind of making it up as I go along. Happy to share all of the information that I have on what works, what doesn't work, and where we have some challenges. Prior to this role, I was in the Federal Reserve System doing data-oriented things for about 25 years, mostly at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, but then also for a little while at the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. I'm also privileged enough to serve as the president of the International Association for Social Science, Information Services, and Technology, also known as IASSIST. It's a community of data professionals in the library, archiving, curator space that has been fabulous to work with over the years and thinks a lot about things like data literacy. I'm also the steering committee co-chair for the newly formed Higher Education Data Governance Community, also known as HEDGE, and happy to answer questions about that at some point, or to see some of your lovely smiling faces at one of our monthly webinars if you are so interested. Oh yeah, and then last year I wrote a book. So some of the topics that we'll talk about today are actually in there if you're interested. We'll see how this goes. So I understand it's common practice to do the whole say what you're going to say it, and then say what you said. I'm terrible at it. We're going to try and give that a bash. I'll let you know that we're going to do a little bit of an introduction. We'll talk about definitions and data and whatnot. We'll talk about data in academia. And then we'll talk about some of the organizational issues that can sometimes make it difficult for data literacy and data governance to get off the ground. And we'll talk about how those two things interact. So the one thing I do need to warn you about is I tell a lot of stories. I have a long history and a long career where I have accumulated lots of you'll never believe this kind of stories, and I'll share some of those with you today. So let's start out with, I don't know, some stories. I'm very, very excited, to be honest, that data are now a hot topic. It used to be that data were only for the nerdy researchers, people who could write code, used to be on punch cards, or they were really the people who understood database schemas and things like that. A colleague once reminisced with me about the data people in his organization being known as the cellar dwellers. They were the ones that sat in the basement with the great big huge mainframe computers and the dot matrix printers, and nobody ever saw them, and they would do all of their stuff. Then they would surface either late in the afternoon or early in the morning, and they'd distribute things to people's desks, and then they'd scurry back to their dens. I'm sure that there are people like that still exist, and organizations where data are not core to their existence, but I can't imagine that, that they're going to last very long. In today's world, we are well and truly in the information age. Every activity, either commercial or personal, now involves data. Believe it or not, the fitness tracker this is my Apple Watch or Fitbit or what have you. That is the biggest sign for me that data are now part of everybody's life. They've been around since 1965. So when they were introduced in 1965 and we gave birth to the metric of 10,000 steps, that was really the first introduction of data from a personal place being part of people's lives. The need for the understanding of data has continually increased since then. So data have been important as long as I have been alive, so that's cool. I haven't been doing it quite that long, but long enough. Now we create data with every keystroke, with every step, with every click, with every purchase, and just about any activity that can be measured or tracked. I recently read an estimate that said 1.7 megabytes of data is created every second by every person during the year of 2020. So last year, the year that the world turned upside down and we all spent even more time online than we had before, we were creating vast quantities of data by every human being every second of the day. That's an enormous amount of information. But for the longest time, even though we had this 1965 was a long time ago for our personal data issues, it was still, and it still is seen as data being a nerdy kind of topic, right? The idea that data could be helpful for everyday life still hasn't permeated all over our society. And over the time that this particular idea has been developing, it hasn't always been discussed in terms of data or data literacy. Years ago, we spent a lot of time talking about statistics and statistical literacy. And those are phrases that pretty much scared the bejesus out of everybody. Both of my daughters have had at some point in their college careers back in those days, had to complain about taking some kind of a statistics class. And they would call me up and go, Mom, like, you really like this stuff? What is wrong with you? And so the whole notion of statistics is different in my mind than data. The focus is on the measures and the publication or the dissemination of that information rather than on the way that they're constructed and the metrics or the underlying information that went into those metrics. And so now we've got so much data and so many different approaches to analyzing them. We've got data science, we've got machine learning, we've got AI, artificial intelligence, that are all now mainstream topics. Or at least the saving of the snow leopards by Microsoft would, in the commercials, would make you think that this is something that everybody does, is this AI stuff. Even if that's not true, being able to program your thermostat and understand what that does, understand how you use your fitness tracker to track your sleep, to track everything under the sun. We've got food apps, we've got exercise apps. All of that requires that you understand data and data literacy, which makes it more important from an everyday perspective, regardless of whether or not you're in higher education, whether or not you work with data as part of your job or anything else. So data literacy is important. But the first thing you should ask is, but San, what do you mean by data literacy? And that's a really important place to start. There isn't a single definition, like data governance, there's no single definition for data governance. There's also no single definition for data literacy. So my favorite working definition is that data literacy is the ability to read, understand, create, and communicate data as information. Okay, so read, understand, create, and communicate. We're going to talk about different activities under that umbrella in a little while. But the whole idea is, how do you turn numbers into an understanding of concepts, the same way that general literacy is the ability to turn letters into the concepts that those combinations of letters are meant to represent. Very, very similar idea. You've got a series of numbers, and we can argue whether or not data are all numeric, because there are some people that believe that anything that is digital is data. But I would argue that if you can't represent it in some sort of alphanumeric formats, you can't analyze it. So therefore, I think it's safe to talk about data as being alphanumeric representations of a measurable concept. Don't hold me to that. But the idea of data literacy is really important to understand, not just how you take those digital objects and understand the concepts or the content that they are trying to represent, but to be able to understand the context and what you can and can't do with data. And so it wouldn't be a talk about data if there weren't some data. So we're going to work with a really kind of entertaining, I hope, example that is Google's search trends. So if you go and you go to Google search, the Google search trend website, you can type in words or phrases and Google will tell you relatively how many times other people have searched for that. And you can do this all the way back to 2004. That's as far back as their search data go. And so what I wanted to do was to show you this lovely little chart that says, all right, over the last 16 or so years, what has the trend for interest in data literacy looked like, especially relative to statistical literacy? And so people love to produce charts like this to show how data savvy they are. And you look at this and you can say, okay, so we've got a whole bunch of activity in 2004. And then you can see that we start to get this divergence around 2012, 2013, where data literacy looks like it's a more prominent thing to search for than statistical literacy. And so it feels like this is telling a really interesting story, because obviously we've got places where statistical literacy is, only here around 10 and data literacy is up here at 40. So obviously the data literacy concept is 4 times more interesting than statistical literacy. Hopefully somebody somewhere is sitting there going, but wait, what do those numbers mean? Because one of the things that is a really key component of data literacy is knowing when you don't know what the data are. And so that's when you need some documentation. And so people who have been working in this area for a really long time know that if you don't have the axes labeled appropriately, okay, you don't have a good description of what it is you want people to take away from a presentation of information like this, then you're going to have a real problem. And if you're not really data literate enough, you don't realize that you don't know what this means. If you look at this documentation, you'll notice that the numbers represent search interest relative to the highest point on the chart for a given region and time. A value of 100 is the peak popularity for the term. And a value of 50 means the term is half as popular. So to be honest, it's not really fair to compare the orange line for data literacy to the blue line for statistical literacy, because it's really relative to its own history that these metrics are being pulled out. And to say that data literacy had peak popularity in September of 2004, and that the popularity of that term now is less in 2019 and 2020, what does peak popularity mean, right? So this really doesn't tell you and doesn't give you as much information as you think it does on first glance. And the ability to appreciate and understand that is a key component of data literacy for life in general. Okay, regardless of whether or not we're talking about academia. I purposely chose an example that had nothing to do with academia. We're going to talk enough about student melt and all of that kind of stuff at some point. So now you've got an introduction to where I'm going and what my starting point is. Data literacy is the ability to, edit, create, communicate, understand data as information. Right, you're able to actually turn numbers or digital objects into an understandable concept. And then we get to academia, right? So data are not new in academia, right? The existence of Audi showed that there was recognition as many as, as nearly 50 years ago, that data were not only important, but even that the sharing of data are very important. And in the higher ed world, the fact that there's a function and a discipline called institutional research, or decision support or IRNA, whatever it is you call it. But the notion that you've always had a view of data analytics and institutional analytics that is a core part of your business model and the business process, it's really, really telling, because that's not the case in a lot of industries. So data in academia are not new. And even the analytics for academia are not new. But the world has changed and the world is changing. If we think about the traditional, and I do air quotes a lot, and I'm sorry because I can't see your faces to see you rolling your eyes at my air quotes. The whole idea of the traditional realms or domains in which analytics have been focused in higher ed, students, finances, employees, faculty and staff, those sorts of things. There's now a whole lot more information, more data about other aspects of the higher education ecosystem than just those traditional domains. There is a greater recognition that data of all kinds can be helpful, but there isn't always an appreciation of what that means. So everybody wants to be a data-driven organization, be a data-driven university, make data-driven decisions. But what does that mean? If we have had a traditional understanding that data are very important for understanding higher ed operations and the focus and the mission for some of our higher ed activities, if it's always been important, why aren't we doing it? Why are we just now becoming data-driven universities or being urged to make data-driven decisions? Haven't we been doing it already? And I would argue that it's because we don't have the right level of data literacy outside our traditional areas, right? IR, again, been doing this for a long time. There's other places, I would argue in some institutions, the IT folks have been carrying the banner around this, mostly because people still think that data are an IT issue, but I'll get on that soapbox another time. What we need in order to be able to do data better is for people in more roles to be better at understanding and doing data. And this means everyone from the department admins to senior leaders. Now, I don't want to cast aspersions on anyone in any particular role, because sweeping with a very broad brush is a dangerous way of generalizing people's capacity and capabilities. But I would say that every university is going to find that they've got a wide distribution of data savviness in a variety of levels. Very few people right now even still think in terms of data. Senior leaders, admins, faculty members, general staff, maintenance folks, they think in terms of the questions they want answers, they want to have answers for, and they assume that data will answer them. But what does it mean to be able to do that? And how much do you need to understand the data that you're using to answer those questions in order for the answers to be meaningful? So the thing is about data in academia is that the variety of data types, the variety of data domains, the variety of data uses, right? So for those of you who are into the big data concept, variety is one of the V's. It means more people need to know more things about more kinds of data than ever before. So now we're not just talking about admission statistics. We're not just talking about faculty appointment information. We're talking about data from sensors. We're talking about data from administrative records. We're talking about touch points to business processes. These are not the same as the kind of statistics or metrics that we've had in the past from doing surveys or doing census snapshots and things like that. So understanding what data can be used for what purposes and what the pitfalls are if you do something wrong is more critical than ever. And that's really at the heart of data literacy. So why is it so difficult, and why is higher ed different? Let's start with the organizational issues. Every organization has silos. My favorite joke to make is about how my organization is the only one that has silos, and everybody in the room will chuckle because it doesn't matter whether you work at a poultry processing plant, it doesn't matter if you work in an office building and a defense contractor, every organization has silos. I would argue that higher ed cements those by the internal structure of the organization itself. In a large corporation, the marketing department, for example, may not work directly with the HR department. But the folks in marketing and the folks in HR both understand that they are part of company X and they're working towards the strategic goals for company X. In many academic institutions, that may actually not be the case. People see themselves as part of the engineering school or the business school, and they're really dedicated to working hard towards the goals that those units have set, which may or may not actually align directly with the strategic goals for the university. They're never far out of alignment, but they may not be perfectly in alignment. This seems to be especially true of schools that have specific branding. If a school has been named in honor of someone, or a donor has given a buku amount of money to have a school named after them, then they want everybody to know that name, regardless of the name of the university. And so that really encourages that sort of local focus and local identity. So you may or may not know that the University of Rochester has 8 schools. Some of them are named. So we've got the Eastman Institute for Oral Health, we've got the Warner School of Education, we've got the Simon School of Business, we've got the Eastman School of Music, we have the Hagen School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. And then we have a couple of others that aren't actually named for anyone. So I'm going to use our Eastman School for an example. It is a school of music that competes with places like Juilliard and Berklee School of Music for talent, both in terms of students and in terms of faculty. They are very concerned about making sure that the prospective students or prospective faculty members know Eastman, because Eastman is the school that has the reputation in the music world. If they're really trying to get somebody to look at Eastman as opposed to Juilliard or Berklee, the fact that Eastman is part of the University of Rochester is not relevant. And so this fractured organization really means that data activities are concentrated on local issues without an enterprise or global awareness. We, believe it or not, we actually have people that work at the University of Rochester that do not know that Eastman School of Music is a school of the University of Rochester. And that makes me a little sad. But even if they do know they are part of the same organization, they don't see the similarities between their particular school or department or center and another part of the university. The data activities that go on at those levels are probably pretty common across different disciplines in different schools. And yet it doesn't occur to people that the job that they're doing and the data, the way that they need it, is a similar activity to anybody else. So if an admin in the business school is struggling with knowing how to keep track of all of the classrooms that they are responsible for documenting the usage and who's assigned to them and whatnot, it would probably never occur to them to reach out to somebody at the music school and say, how do you keep track of this stuff? The music school has to do it. So does the education school. So does the Eastman Institute for Oral Health. They all need to worry about classroom management practices and understanding how to maintain that data. But it doesn't occur to them that there's a community of people that do what they do because of the local dedication that various roles have to focus on what it is that goes on in their particular area. So what this means is that data literacy is often unevenly distributed. So one department or one school might have somebody who really gets it, who is real data savvy. And under other circumstances, you'd have sort of a community interaction that would allow that kind of knowledge to get passed around and shared more easily. But our structure and our silos means it's impossible for that really to happen organically. And that is one of the bigger challenges from a community dissemination and spread of information. In addition, we also have a bit of an issue with the central versus decentralized analytics. This is sort of the holy war of the data science, data analytics organizational world. There is really not a good consensus about whether having centralized data and analytics operations that serve an entire organization, higher ed or otherwise, or having embedded analytics and data organizations that serve local needs, regardless of the organization. There are pluses and minuses to both of those. When you consider that higher ed has a history of having this concept of institutional research, decision support, et cetera, then you've already got one group who has this stake in the sand about activities that they do. If a department or a school or a center has analytic needs that don't involve the traditional focus of the institutional research areas, they tend to be dealt with by embedded analysts. So often this is appropriate. Often you need somebody who's going to be able to focus on a specific need. If you've got to worry about how many wet labs you have versus dry labs and things like that, then the chemistry department is going to be more concerned about that than the English department. But what it often leads to is a duplication of efforts between the embedded analysts and central functions that can generally be found in institutional research or IT. And similar analytical endeavors can often result in different outputs if there are vastly different levels of data literacy or vastly different levels of subject matter expertise within the analytics staff. One of the first things that I encountered when I started at the University of Rochester was a report on faculty diversity that was being put together by the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, had a very different presentation of the information, including different numbers, than the one that was a report that was put together by our human resources function. And that was mostly because they were using different definitions of faculty. And that is a data governance and data literacy issue to be able to have good conversations about what standardization means, how to actually use the same or similar definitions across multiple business lines, how to document what it is that you're doing, et cetera, et cetera. If you don't understand that that's important, or if you are cherry picking your definitions to make your statistics look better, that's something that you really need to have some intense conversations about. It can cause lots of problems in the long run. And speaking of faculty counts, there's faculty. I don't want this to be a faculty bashing presentation, but you gotta be aware that higher ed is unique for data governance and data literacy issues because we have a class of employees that have a special status unlike anything I've seen in the corporate world. Faculty are highly educated and experts in their fields. No question there. They are not however, always data literate. Don't tell them I said that. In fact, I would argue that there are areas where data are not a concern for research at all. Okay, so the humanities is the one that gets a bad rap as being people that really don't care about, numeracy and all that kind of stuff. But the digital humanities are changing that. And so it's not even necessarily broad areas, but there's even niches where the notion of using quantitative measures and data, even as part of research, is just not a thing. But even where people are using data as part of their research, they may know about their topics and they may know about the subject matter of the data that they are using or collecting, but they don't really understand data as the concept of this raw material that needs to be appropriately addressed. So back in my Fed days, I was working with some economists who found this really cool new data source that they were going to use to do research. And I can't even remember the topic at the time, but my job was to help people understand and find suitable places where the data could be housed and analyzed and whatnot. And so I was trying to help them think through all of the details that they would need to work out before all the ink got dry on the contract and the vendor was just like, no, tough, you have to take what we agreed on. And so I was asking them, okay, so, how big, how many observations, how many variables, this, that, and the next thing. And I said, okay, so who's going to manage the data? We're on a conference call, back in the days when we actually just used phones, and there's dead silence on the other end of the phone. And there was two of them. One of them said, we're going to put it on a server. Okay, I got that. But who's going to manage it? And I could tell that if they were in the same room, they were looking at each other going, what is with this woman? What is she talking about? And he says, no, but we're going to put it on a server. I said, no, I get that. The problem is that you're buying this information, this data set, and are you going to get updates to it? Oh yeah, we're going to get monthly files. Okay. What are you going to do with those monthly files? Silence. And I thought, please don't tell me. And they did. We're going to put it on the server. So even the whole concept that there's going to be some data manipulation possible, potential. There's going to potentially be data quality issues. Somebody's got to actually document, did we get the data that we were expecting? Did it look the way we get? How did we join it properly? Just putting it on a server doesn't get you anything. That's not managing data. And I know that this is one of the things that my colleagues at Rochester have taken a long time to get their heads around, because we think very much IT forward and integrations are the world. Right? As soon as you have two things that you can integrate, you can have one database that's talking to another database and you're done. And the answer is no, sometimes you need more than that. Sometimes you actually need active data management. And that understanding is a key component of data literacy. So the context for all of this is the whole notion of how data literacy actually serves to support the data governance work that we're trying to do. Being data literate for the sake of being data literate is very important, but it is crucial for trying to actually do data governance in any size, shape, or form. It's nearly impossible to do data governance if people don't have some basic data literacy, okay? Understanding of data issues and being data literate is fundamental for the change that is necessary and that data governance brings about. Whether you think it does or not, all data governance activities involve change. And if you don't have a fundamental appreciation of the power of data and the importance of good data management, then data governance just is seen as a bureaucratic hurdle rather than a strategic enabler. Now, most people want to do the right thing. I have this positive view of humanity where most of the time people really want to do the right thing. But they need to know what the right thing is, and they need to understand why they're doing it. And so the idea is it's the WIFM, right? The what's in it for me is still going to be really important for a lot of data governance activities, and understanding and having people understand that everyday activities involve data, and they need to be more comfortable with being data literate, being data savvy, whatever your favorite term is. That can be a really tough thing to convince people of, especially when you've got the sort of long-standing employees who've always done it this way and you want them to do something different. That provides true challenges. And being able to get people to recognize how this benefits them, their department, their line of business, their university is really important. Couple of key areas, for example. Data quality is one of the #1 reasons that any organization starts a data governance program, right? Everybody knows that you need good data. Well, what do you mean by good, right? The whole notion of data quality is really squishy and amorphous if you don't have the ability to get a little more technical and have people understand that data quality is not just accuracy. That's a really important component. But you know what? Sometimes you're willing to sacrifice accuracy for timeliness. Because guess what? If you've got second by second data or something that is information that's just captured right now, it may not be 100% right. But maybe that's more important. Maybe you're much more concerned with completeness. Do you actually have information from all of your students, from all of your faculty? Maybe you're much more concerned about consistency, that the information you have about Joe Smith, the student employee, is the same in your student information system as it is in your HR system. All of these are components of data quality. And if you don't have people who understand data quality as a concept, because I don't do data, I just type stuff into spreadsheets, then there's no way to get them to appreciate that fixing a typo in a spreadsheet is a data quality remediation activity. Very big words, it frightens people. You can get them to appreciate that. You can get them to start thinking about whether it's more important to take time to clean things up because accuracy is more important, or if somebody needs this information right away, then you need to let them know that this is the most timely data that we have, but it might be dirty. All of these are really key for understanding how people are going to interact with information. Metadata management. Shout out to my librarian friends. If you don't have data literacy in your population, then people do not have an appreciation for the value of good metadata, for the value of documented data definitions, or for the importance of data catalogs. You can't do data governance without all of these. And unless people understand how metadata are helpful, what it actually means, how to expend the right amount of effort to get the payoff that you need from metadata, you're not going to get anywhere. And then there's data management in general. It's really important to let people know that, as I said, making changes to your spreadsheet, that's managing data. Getting them to understand that spreadsheets are not the best way to manage data is really important. I know the spreadsheets rule the world. Anybody who really truly believes that Bill Gates is trying to run the world by injecting chips in our vaccines hasn't spent 30 seconds to think that Bill Gates can bring the world to its knees by actually just deleting Excel, right? Seriously. I was in a meeting once about data governance issues many, many years ago when I was still at the Fed, and we were talking about data management and things like that. And somebody who thankfully was not in the room but was on speakerphone actually said out loud, as soon as they have version control for Excel, all my problems will be gone. And I wanted to scream that Excel is not a data management tool, but I was silenced. but there isn't an understanding of that. So off that soapbox, and talking about the other thing that you need to do in order for data literacy and data governance to be successful together is you need to teach people, but you also need to support them. So if you think about how people learn to be data literate, it's really kind of new, right? We saw that pointless chart with all of the Google Trends information. In 2000, you might find a couple dozen scholarly articles on data literacy. Okay, in 2020, you'd find more than 2,000. There are multiple data literacy programs on platforms like edX. A friend of mine actually did one. There's more than 100 courses on Coursera. There's over 1,000 courses on LinkedIn Learning. You've got specialty platforms such as the Data Literacy Project and dataliteracy.com that have even more options. And so do lots of software companies who want you to learn to be data literate using their tool. Tableau is one of the biggest offenders here. They've got all kinds of really cool data literacy courses that you can take as long as you don't mind paying for Tableau. The biggest challenge that I have found with these is that they tend to be geared toward analysts in the corporate world, and they may not be as helpful in higher ed, where people's goals for being data literate aren't necessarily career progression or corporate profits. In order for universities to really raise the level of data literacy, they need to start thinking about what data literacy looks like for them. Because we all know that higher ed is a special snowflake. You know, we're different, we're not like anybody else. And while that is true, some of the basic things that we need to know about data literacy are available as general training. Some of them may not be, right? So one of the things that we're working on in Rochester is trying to actually define what are competencies for data literacy. That's sort of what's embedded in our data literacy definition about evaluate, create, communicate. We just wanted to take it one step further. And so we're in the process now of working with our Data Governance Council, our governing body at the university, to say, what does it actually mean to be data literate at the University of Rochester? How do we actually talk about what skills or capabilities you might have? And so we've talked about discovering data, which everybody hates because they think it's not what it means in the library world. Create, evaluate, manage, understand, handle, use responsibly, communicate. So we're outlining some of the actual competencies that we want. And then what we'd like to be able to do is to define some scale to describe levels of mastery. We have a lot of work to go on this. And even then, when we're done, it's still not enough. So we need to provide support for people as they improve their literacy skills if we want to move our data governance work forward. For those of you involved in this area, you should know by now that life doesn't stop because we're doing data governance. And if we want to ask people to take on new skills and know when to use them and be comfortable doing so, that's going to take time. And the premise of sort of change management 101 is you've got to help people get to where they need to be and provide resources for them to support what it is they're learning so that it becomes second nature for them to do so. So for example, we are starting with a very basic thing. We want people to ask permission to use data before they're granted access. Strange, I know. For a lot of folks, that means asking, is it okay if I use these data in this way? Before you say, can I have access to the database? Can you send me the spreadsheet? So the process that we've introduced actually involves a request ticketing system, so we can keep track of things. We can route requests to the right person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, people don't always know about this new process, or they know and they just don't care because they're going to rely on their old habits. They're going to call the person they know has the data and ask for a spreadsheet. So we've had some success with the data stewards to help point users to this new process so that they can become more familiar with it. Or if that doesn't work, my office of one is ready to be there to actually fill out the form for them so that they're gradually brought into the new world. So my office is called the Data Governance and Support Office because we wanted to make it clear that it's not just about the hurdles, it's not just about the bureaucracy, the compliance, it's also how do we help you move along this sphere, and data literacy is one of the things that we're trying to help with. And finally, I don't have to tell you that higher ed moves slowly. I used to work for the government, and if you had told me back then that there was an industry that moved more slowly than government, I would have laughed at you. And yet, there we are. So we're learning slowly to have patience and focus on the small things. So our motto is small steps directionally correct. So anybody who's ever heard me talk about data governance will know that I have an obsession with the Wizard of Oz and the Emerald City. And I always like to talk about I am Dorothy, and I am here to take you to the Emerald City and protect you from the flying monkeys and the evil trees and the poppies that make you sleep, and et cetera, et cetera. But we need to know where the Emerald City is, and then we need to take small steps in the right direction. And we're not going to get there overnight, right? Look at what Dorothy had to go through. So as an economist, an outcome is considered a Pareto improvement if it makes at least one person better off without making anyone else worse off. And so that's what we aim for. If at the end of the day, at the end of a project, at the end of a week, at the end of a discussion, we've got one person whose life is marginally better than it was before we started whatever the object du jour is, and nobody else is worse off, we've done a good job. Small steps directionally correct. Sometimes we actually make it and are able to improve one person's life without making anybody else's life worse off. Sometimes it takes multiple attempts, but we're still always moving. Sometimes we're moving so slowly it doesn't feel like we're moving, but we are moving. And so with that, I just want to say thank you very much for the opportunity to share all of my inner musings about these things. I hope you have found them to be entertaining, if not informative. And I welcome the opportunity to answer questions under other circumstances when we can either be in the same room, or I'm actually in the same Zoom session as you, or email, or what have you. But thank you very much, and stay safe, and I hope to see you all sometime soon. Bye-bye.